The problem with design becoming invisible, as you know, is that it becomes opaque to both the designer and the user. So as long as we can't see what it's doing, we can't interact with it, we can't engage with it, we can't take it apart and put it back together. And I think there's a certain responsibility for designers to give us the hooks in order to participate and co-create and, as I say, rebuild it rather than creating black boxes. I think the black box version of design, which is perhaps the aim of an invisible design, one which is seamless and embedded in the environment or wherever, is extremely patronizing form of designing, in that it says, I'm the creator, I give you this tool, it's concealed and it will do its job, and I've made sure it will do it perfectly, which, as we know, is not how design works. For something like the financial system, with all the algo traders, and nobody knows how to take that apart. Nobody knows how that system got put together, with all the incentives and triggers and aims and flows. We can't unpick that, and nobody knows really how it works anymore. So that's a problem, I think, where something was composed in such a concealed, invisible way that we're now dependent on it, and we can't stop it either.
I think problems start to emerge when designers get on their high horse and say, oh no, the interface has to disappear. Because by doing that, they put all of the power into both the hands of the designer and into the hands of the people who run the services and the devices and the infrastructures. It concerns me how much technology and infrastructure is being hidden, especially now as we move into systems that have an element of AI or smartness.
You're putting a set of processes that are meaningful in the hands of a set of systems that are operating so quickly and at such scale that no human can intervene with them meaningfully at any point, should they be behaving in a way that you don't like. And that's just a simpler way of saying, hey, what happens when the robots take over, or whatever. And it's kind of like, well, that's a simple way of saying that software is running too quickly and too much, or not too much, but it's just dealing with a huge amount very, very quickly in a way that we can't perceive. So there's definitely a legibility issue. Whether it's the responsibility of designers to resolve it, maybe it is. I mean, this is one of the things I find fascinating, because it's almost broadly, completely ignored by the software industry. So the tech sector has got no interest in it, in revealing or making legible these systems. It's not because it thinks anything bad will happen if it does. It just doesn't care. It's indifferent to them. Because, as we said, people will use bad apps to get things they find valuable. So they'll suffer monstrous technical experiences like configuring the Wi-Fi on your old Samsung TV or whatever, or to get iPlayer working or YouTube running on their TV. They'll suffer it. So the idea we're going to visualize machine learning in a way that makes it legible or sensible to people feels a little bit unlikely to me, because the motivations for the people working on it are not there. The visualization they want is that they beat the Go player. That's the visualization, that's the gravity and the evidence in that space.
What are the implications of, we see the vectors that maybe others don't. They see the thing, we see where the thing is pointing. So we're obliged to kind of come to terms with that. Technology certainly has its own kind of imperatives, right? Artists need to have a seat at the table in determining technological objectives and determining where we're going, even if it's simply interpreting where we're going for us, right? But artists who find themselves in the roles of creative interpreters are thinking about how technology is affecting our lives and interpreting that to us sometimes through the medium itself. Design is often working, not always, but often working in the service of capitalism, right? And art avoid capitalism either, but is able to take a kind of critical stance against it, or to function in ways in which money isn't the only objective, but in which sort of pure expression or aesthetics are the value, independent of financial value. And we need art to do that as well. We need art to tell us stuff that commerce can't.
As designers, as artists, there's a very important responsibility to provide the rest of us with an imagination for this world that scientists haven't yet described.
To rerun the 20th century, the problem was that we thought we could understand all of those things on our own. And that's where you end up with the problems of modernism as being monocultural, as being dead places to live, all the hangovers that we have from the public housing that was built in the mid 20th century is all because architects did it with their blinkers on in isolation, without consulting with the public or with other professionals who might have been able to do a better job. So if we're going to claim that position of authority and of designing whole cities, then we need to do it just as one person at a table, and perhaps we coordinate that table and who else sits at it, and listen to their views. But it needs to be a much more distributed form of knowledge, which is about consultation and synthesis, rather than top-down modernist authority.
What does the designer do that other disciplines don't? If we come back to those techniques like integrative thinking, the ability to perceive complex systems relatively quickly, but at the right level of detail to understand them as a system, the ability to synthesize or propose or make a proposition, the ability often to use visualizing skills to do that, and then this kind of stewardship role where you're taking an idea from ultimately, at some point, blank piece of paper through to realization, execution, operation and beyond, and trying to keep the design vision solid through that process. And there's a lot of buffeting going on, as you know. There's 3 or 4 things that I think are designerly skills when taken together. Other disciplines have elements of those, of course, individually, but I think that set is kind of an interesting way of thinking about what a designer does. And then you drop that into a craft skill area. So an industrial designer might do all of those things in the context of making a machine, or making a vehicle, or making furniture. An architect will do all of those things in the context of making spaces. I think interaction design and service design does all of that stuff too. I think there's a set of design skills where that more sort of systemic kind of relationship-based approach is really useful. Industrial design, interaction design, user experience, service design, architecture, those kinds of things. It's probably not quite the same with graphic design. It's probably not quite the same with fashion design. They are maybe skewed more towards the craft and less towards the system. This work of a designer in the context of an urban plan for a neighborhood in Amsterdam, say, or Stockholm, where we're saying, we don't know how people are going to live in 2025, but we've got to make the neighborhood anyway. So how do we design a way forward in this where we talk less about planning, this idea of strategic planning, where we pretend we can draw 2030 in total detail. We hand over the drawing of that. We all cross our fingers and hope that that's going to happen. Of course, it never does. Hence all of the modernist planning disasters of the 20th century. But instead we take what we call like this data-driven strategy approach, where we're just taking short steps and constant readings, like navigating a boat, basically. We're trying to get that kind of language, which I think is not unnatural for designers, because it is like a series of sketching your way forward from step to step, and then locking some decisions down that seem to work, and then saying, cool, we got that base, now let's build the next bit. What we're then trying to do is then help planners who don't tend to think like that, urban planners. They tend to think, what's 2030 look like, because you've got to build that. And then politicians and civil servants who like to know the answer before they get there, because that's the way that procurement sort of works. Tell us how many jobs we're going to have in this neighbourhood in 2028, you know, and we've got like a zero carbon strategy by 2030. Can we do that or not? It's like, well, I sort of want to say come back to me in 2028, but I can't say that. So let's start now with a trajectory and a set of informed first steps, and then let's make sure that we can be agile about that, so we don't lock in too much. Let's not lock in the district heating plant or the big canal, just in case that the big canal turns out to be a bad idea in 10 years' time. Let's make something a bit more agile. So let's make half the canal and some other way of dealing with the excess rainfall or something. And then in 2025, if it's not working, then let's make the other half, you know. And that is total common sense, but really hard to get through. And it feels like, to me, that feels like, again, a sort of a design-led approach, because as a designer, you have to take those steps and figure them out and just kind of draw your way forward bit by bit. Unless you're a genius, it's hard to jump straight to the finished, production drawings, isn't it? You have to kind of do it in pieces and test and build some prototypes, for instance.
I would never have imagined that 10 years later I'd still be working with scientists and engineers. And that process has been kind of difficult and troubled and interesting. And I found at the beginning, because I knew nothing, writing to engineers and scientists, going to their labs, was a very kind of rewarding process, because I basically was asking really naive questions, and that was kind of useful because I was revealing something that either they wouldn't ask or they hadn't realised that other people didn't know, sort of non-experts. So there was this really rich opportunity for, first of all, misunderstanding, which generated ideas, and for being the one to ask the obvious question and to kind of put your hand up and feel I wasn't shy about sort of saying, well, I don't, what is this thing, or how does it work? Mm-hmm. And getting them to reflect on their own assumptions. But over time, and working kind of more deeply and in a more embedded way with synthetic biologists, I learned, it took me years to realise that we understood design differently. Like, we were all using this word design, and they were, it maybe took me like 2 or 3 years to realise that we were using the same word to describe different things. So the engineers were talking about engineering, and they were talking about an iterative process. Whereas from my training in a more experimental design practice was to think about kind of chaos in a way. It was about exploring and not having a definite answer. And through that process, I also learned that there were some other really common words that we use differently, like experiment. So I remember in my master's, my tutor saying, go and conduct some experiments. And I remember saying, do you mean scientific experiments, or do you mean design experiments? Because I'd already figured out that this was completely different. One, to me, meant closing down options to try and find, to prove something. Whereas for a designer, it's about opening up and about creating and generating unknowns. And that's a very different set of assumptions with the same word that we use very easily in these spaces. So a lot of collaborating was actually trying to pinpoint how we were talking across purposes a lot of the time. Synthetic biologists, they say they want to make fuel, they want to make new kinds of materials, they want to make medicines, they want to make kind of unknown other things. And in a way, you suddenly have this whole kind of space opened up where design can get involved. But at the same time, what was exciting for me, and I think still is really exciting, is that we kind of get to define what design means in that space. So what does it mean to design a living thing? I don't know the answer. I think it's different to what's come before. And, are we just sort of designing materials that are living, or are they dead? Or are you using biology as a manufacturing kind of factory to make stuff that... I think there aren't any clear sort of answers. And that's what's really exciting for designers, is that it is a space to actually explore these questions that comes back to actually, well, what is it to design stuff?
I think for the first time in American history, scientists are actually marching in the streets, right? Like scientists are actually banding together on the streets, demanding to be taken seriously. Which, by the way, they should do, and they have, it's not just that they have every right to do it, it's important that they do that. But the fact that that's happening is the evidence of the broader failure of their collective ability to be understood as part of culture, for their mandates and priorities, and let alone their knowledge, just their mandates and priorities, for those to be culturally absorbed and given the appropriate weight by a nation and a world that are totally dependent on them, in concrete ways. And so if you look at the march as the noble attempt to compensate, in a way, for the lack of cultural currency, I guess one of the questions is, why is there a deficit in the first place? And I think there's a lot of reasons for it. One aspect of it is that real, proper science, very conscientious, thoughtful, responsible science, will always be a bad narrative, because narratives, stories, are basically a form of compressing information and transmitting information from human to human in a way that it can actually enter the brain. And it relies on being able to say yes, definitely, or fuck no, or never, or always, or certainly. And those are not good science words. Science words are, 97% probable. Science words are, n number of scientists agreed with, etc., or it works n% of the time. So the question is how scientists and their work can be communicated in a way that is persuasive, right? Because the things that are persuasive aren't the things that are true. What designers do is get people to feel something about things that really could be one thing or could be the other, right? But if you feel something about it, that's how you actually make your decisions. And so it is kind of up to designers. Even during the Scientists' March, I just kept looking at the signs that the designers had, and I was like, these signs are just, you can't even fucking understand these signs unless you're a scientist. What is your goal? Like, what are you trying to do? But and I get it. I know how that happens, right? And I love them for that. I love scientists for that. But that was exactly the point at which no designer would have ever done a march with signs that couldn't be understood by 99% of the American public. A designer's march would be more persuasive, because that's what designers do. They persuade, they convince, they find their ways to get people to feel something about something, and that's just not a scientist's job. And so we need one another, and I am optimistic that more and more designers are working more closely with more and more scientists and vice versa, but there's still a far way to go.
So designers are becoming much more mediators, moderators, catalysts that evoke a certain closer relationship to the materials. And the interesting aspect here is that it becomes clear the design as a discipline is the one that is strongly and sort of most evidently connected to these questions of our material, culture and environment.
Yeah, designers occupy a quite powerful position in a lot of processes, and they have power in the relationship between manufacturers, infrastructures, policy systems and end users. And there are things to do there where designers are able to advocate for a humane way of doing things. Yeah, part of that should be about making sure that people have agency and control over the systems they use.
We as designers need to have more and more an ethical foundation. Why are we doing it? For whom we are doing it? And what's the impact over a time span which goes beyond my perceived lifespan?
So if you're designing a bacteria or a baby, which could well happen, if we're using words like design to do that, and those words are used a lot, like designer babies, which is becoming an increasingly near future. How do we even begin to think about design ethics in that space? So we have bioethics, and there are bioethicists. So there aren't clear answers to these issues. And in a way, I see using design as a framework is a really interesting way to address those questions, and that potentially makes the practice of designing biology better somehow. The idea around kill switches, that's a very real thing in synthetic biology, where people are saying, well, we can design a system that will kill itself and it will make it safe. And there's a lot of debate whether that will work. Will that system evolve out of a design? So if you design an organism to kill itself after 20 days or however many days, will that be reliable? But to actually be, I'm sort of taking it out into a public space and then bringing it back in, and then it kind of takes on a different, that public outing puts a new veneer on it when you're looking at it back in synthetic biology, saying, well, actually this is a bit awkward. We're talking about things killing themselves, or how would you make that reliable?
I hope designers really will take a stand for the welfare and the values of the people for whom they're designing as they're designing, so that they use their entire toolkit of capabilities, from going out and looking at people, from understanding the history of how a particular product or technology happened, how a particular set of design decisions were made, so that they use their understanding of the business behind the design. Why is this company or this organization making this thing now? What is this going to do for it? In order to bring the vision of a more humane, more human-centered product service experience, rather than one that's purely based on projecting a technology onto people.
People have been talking about the politics of latent in technologies for some time, but I think that those questions have crested, maybe in this community, now more than ever. We're seeing politics, whether implicit or explicit, in our technologies and in our media technologies and in our own works with those media technologies that we are now aware of more than ever, in terms of who's omitted and how are people represented, who's able to participate, who has a voice.
If you are somebody who's looking at these things with an intent to kind of make a better place, I think these are tools that have a lot of influence and power, and they shouldn't be relegated to the big banks and the military. They should actually be utilized by citizens and by everybody to try to better understand our world, better understand ourselves, and to put limits on those systems as well. I don't think that everybody should be monitoring everything all the time and have that data be a free-flowing soup for everything. So how then do we decide what fits where, and how do we even have a discourse about it? And I think using those tools and technologies is the only way we can, is to try to communicate in a way that is human, that will allow us to to try to understand how the systems work and how they can be utilized and controlled. It's just fundamentally about all of those systems that are deciding, how we value things. And I think that will, it has for a long time been an important topic and will probably be way more important in the near future. I mean, we look at things like universal basic income, and we look at all these alternative structures that are starting to pop up, and I think it's true that more and more meaningful jobs are being created by these technologies, but the pace and the rate at which technology changes and shifts is not the rate at which humans change and shift. And as that gets faster and faster, we're going to have some things to confront, I think.
I think the value of critical design is to say, well, there are various routes we could take. What would it mean, and how would we respond, and how would we live, or how could we live, and how would our values change?
People sometimes say I'm a speculative designer, and I don't. I prefer to be a critical designer. I think that I use speculation, but it's a matter of semantics that is important to me. So I spend time kind of imagining, extrapolating the current sort of trends in synthetic biology into future spaces. But I do that not to imagine how they could be, but I see it as actually they become devices to act on the present. So I'm very much still designing it for the present. And I really like the idea of critical design as a question-seeking practice. It's making problems, it's finding those problems, it's using design as research. And the reason to do that is to challenge, the way things are, to challenge those systems.
So when we have students doing a form of speculative, critical project that is about sparking debate and having conversations and being provocative, we demand the audience. So if you're going to think about an environmental future where you design new objects because of climate change, who is the audience that you want to spark that debate with? And go and have it to them, and construct the framework in which that debate happens and work out whether it worked or not. Did the debate do the thing that you hoped?
There's lots of misunderstanding about speculative design. I think speculative design is a very broad church because there are critical practitioners who use speculation, and then you have commercial practitioners who use speculation. So a prototype product is a speculative design. And by that definition, it's a financial speculation. It's saying, let's make this thing become real. So speculation can be a confusing term, but it's about the attitude. Why are you using it? How do I find a way to kind of articulate these problems and these conflicts with the practice? Critical design was labelled in 97 by Tony Dunn in his PhD thesis. It's not been around for a very long time. It's a continuation of lots of other practices, radical design and all sorts of other kinds of kind of ways of thinking about architecture and design. But I don't think it's very defined yet, and I think there's lots of space to experiment with what it could be. So maybe it's about impacting policy, maybe it's about working with kind of brands and corporations and governments and makers. Maybe it's about much more grassroots, using the techniques to kind of empower people like Carl de Salvo does with adversarial design. I think it's probably all of these different things, and maybe critical design isn't a good label for it, but I find it really exciting to play with using design in these other ways, in these unexpected ways, because it is such a communicative medium, and it seems extravagantly powerful sometimes. So when I work with scientists and engineers, and they get upset about the messages that the work is communicating, you suddenly realize how powerful they see it as a way of communicating with the public.
I think being able to understand time as a dimension in design is a really important, undervalued skill. What a professional futurist does, or what one who's worth their salt does, is help people think systematically and creatively about things that have not happened yet in order to be able to navigate uncertainty more effectively. The future, singular, cannot be studied because the future does not exist. So this is not, just a problem for futurists, it's a problem for everybody, but it's also an opportunity for everybody because the flip side of that unpredictability is agency. We can shape our pathway through change to some degree, not just any way that we want, but within constraints. And we can do that more effectively, so goes the kind of futurist argument, if you like. We can navigate change more effectively if we have a map that shows not just one possible pathway, but multiple possible pathways through possibility space. Possible futures calls for an art of futures. Probable calls for a science of futures, and preferable calls for a politics of futures.
Design has this extra power of visualizing futures which are not there yet. So, and we go back to not just like the importance, but also the responsibility to really make tangible ideas about the futures and visualize them, make them so clear that people can have a conversation about that future. So this role of design as being able to anticipate futures is crucial, not just to show what kind of directions we could take, so what kind of jobs robots could take or so, but also and especially to discuss futures that we don't want for our kids and for the future generations.
I found my way to design because I think futures needs design. And once I was there, I discovered that design needs futures too. Partly because the creation of an experience is a design undertaking, it turns out, but also because the materiality that designers, on the whole, have a kind of native relationship with, the shaping of things is sort of the designer's bailiwick, as I see it. That's the piece that legacy futures just lacks. It's about conceptual infrastructures that are often at 10,000 feet, and unless or until those are tied to decisions that get, and choices that start to shape things on the ground, it's philosophy or it's entertainment. And those are both fine things, but I think at this point in humanity's historical arc, we need to be concerned with having impacts, with how things are shaped. Reciprocally, I think the opposite is true as well, that what designers have traditionally been really good at doing, giving form to things in such a way as to unify the aesthetic and the practical, form and function, all this sort of stuff, those skill sets, those gifts, do not necessarily entail being good at understanding the implications of those choices for the kinds of future that we get or don't get in the bigger picture. I mean, if you focus just on giving form to the object in front of you, and this is the canvas, and this is the only thing you need to worry about, then that edits out everything to do with supply chain, everything that isn't kind of here and now about it. Or that isn't based on the interaction or the use functions of it. Essentially, futures and design are complementary activities, and they have something built into their DNA that the others lacks. Designers, the really good ones, maybe do think about futures and consider those implications because they're thoughtful. But if the training, if the practice contents itself on the whole with just focusing on the here and now, then it's part of the problem. And futures tends to lack an interface to the material, and so design. I realize I'm speaking very broadly, but design is a much needed complement to that.
when I think about the future, I'm afraid and I'm anxious. And I guess the project might be to try and transform that. And in a way that it's kind of about reclaiming the idea of the future, to reclaim optimism. And it's very hard to do that at the moment. You read today about coral bleaching. I mean, we're apparently meant to give up on the Great Barrier Reef. I mean, it's kind of unthinkable. But the only way we can change that is through cooperation, is through working together, is through, I guess, unlocking that agency, so that instead of the future being something done to us, and that's everything from Apple changing their charging cable to the terms of Brexit, to the future being something which we're all co-creating, and technology is the answer as well as the problem. But in terms of specific technologies, there's also a sense that we can reclaim some of them, I think. I mean, that a technology itself has predilections. Let's say it's Facebook's drone for giving the internet to the whole of India or Africa. That technology, which is somehow an extension of military research into autonomous flying planes, also military research into connectivity, all the colonial implications of just rolling out a new service from literally the stratosphere. It's very difficult to see how that can be. And yet we know so much that the internet has, and mobile technology especially, has done more than anything to assist in alleviating poverty in much of the world. So how do we kind of reclaim or adapt that technology, which is clearly amazing, clearly brilliant, to shift it a bit towards a more generous world, instead of a world where the next billion are locked into a proprietary social network, but instead have the possibilities of the internet as an open platform and a place for constructing new realities on top of that. And for me, that's a tiny tweak, so that all the pieces for a positive future are available, and through our agency and intelligence, we can shift them slightly towards a more generous social future.
I was very influenced by a book that I read by Lewis Mumford called Technics and Civilization, which he wrote in 1934. So I read it in the last year. But one of the amazing things about it is when he's writing in 1934 about automation and factory automation, it actually feels like it's it's writing about today, but with computers. And when I had this realization, like he talks about in 1934, how there's this kind of corrosive aspect of machines on society, where he says essentially the way that kind of modern society works with all these machines out there is, at first it makes people do repetitive work. It makes people act like machines. And then as soon as it learns how to have people act like machines, it replaces them with machines. So look at Uber. So Uber is essentially teaching people to act like machines, to act like actuators for this mapping software that they use to drive around. Then it's going to replace them with machines, because already there's going to be self-driving cars. And so those people aren't going to be necessary anymore, because the car's just going to do it itself. And he was talking about this in 1934, and there's also all kinds of other interesting little tidbits, like the fact that industrial production had gone up while the number of people actually employed in industrial production had already significantly gone down in 1934. The trend was clear. And what happened was that there was a giant world war that wiped out the manufacturing capability of a significant chunk of the world, which essentially reset the clock for 50 years. And now we're just back on that trend that was already clear in 1934, at least from my perspective. And that trend is rooted in a fundamental kind of not dealing with the impact of automation. That society just hasn't really grappled with it. It hadn't grappled with it then, it hasn't grappled with it now. I'm not sure kind of where that's going. That's kind of my dystopian view of the future. I do think that designers play a critical role in this because design is the way that, for me, you bring humanism, you bring the focus on people from this abstract notion of like, oh, there are going to be some people who are going to be buying and using that stuff to specific things. Matt is going to be using this. Matt is going to need to do something with this. Matt has a pretty busy day, and he's going to use your thing instead of doing something with his daughter. What does that trade-off mean for Matt? Designers are the ones that bring those narratives, those ideas, those visions into the process of creating experiences so that they are not forgotten to some extent, so that they are incorporated, and so that essentially, instead of replacing people, perhaps what we are doing is extending people. We're augmenting people. We're, instead of like making people unemployed, we give them superpowers. That's the ideal situation. That's the utopian vision. It's really hard. It's really hard to do that. It happens on a regular basis, but it's really hard, and it's not systemically done, and it's not necessarily systemically thought about when technologies and products are created. And I'm really hoping that kind of the designers of the future will really be thinking about what their role is in doing that as they're doing it, and that they just don't do work that isn't about that.
You know, there are people who are keeping traditional crafts and traditional visual languages alive. You have, like, you know, the quilts of Gee's Bend, right? You have these, you know, old ladies who are like making quilts in this kind of like slave tradition that's like, you know, there's like a lot of storytelling that happens there. It's really important to preserve. And you've got people making, you know, traditional crafts of other kinds that's great. But you also have now a different end of the spectrum. You have folks who are creative people who are self-identified as artists or something adjacent to that want to explore want to or feel compelled to explore the critical and cultural and aesthetic potentials of new technologies.
There is a definition from John Heskett. Design is the human capacity to make, to shape and make our environments in ways that satisfy our needs and give meanings to our lives. You know, it doesn't talk about technology, it doesn't talk about specific tools or a specific age, but it talks about this idea of course, satisfying needs, but also giving meaning to life and society in general.
You need to bring poetry into everyday life, into what you design for everyday life. That it's not just about, you know, being able to do something that does something you need. It needs to augment your aesthetic life as well as provide something useful.
I try to always put it into context of our everyday lives, of our experience of, in a way, try to domesticate that technology and to understand, you know, what happens when it's pervasive, or how does it make us feel? How does it make us love? How does it make us, you know, how does it change the dynamics of our families?
We are in this awakening process. Things are changing at a very, very fast pace. Design needs to play a role here and now. We need to be present. We need to be active. We need to be incredible, positive agents of this change. So the question is not so much like how to design something or what to design. It's more like, what are the priorities? What are the challenges that we want to use our time for?
We take something like artificial intelligence, and it's so obviously geared towards solving problems, and it's so obviously going to be useful to navigating these hugely complex data sets and consolidating and learning and adapting and getting infinitely better and better and better. But that's a kind of limited section of life, isn't it? And yes, let's let it run and achieve all those things, but how do we benefit from that energy and possibility in other forms? How does it help us to slow down? How does it help us to design music? How does it help us to, work less? All of these things seemingly are secondary priorities, or at least they require more importantly, they require a cultural shift in order for the technical shift to be realized. And that's maybe where designers can be most useful, is that the promise and the possibility, and it's been around with us for a long time, that machines will do the work and that we'll have more time to water the garden. But our whether it's a Protestant work ethic or whether it's a demonization of people who collect welfare or whatever it is, the idea of not working is so far removed from our current culture that we need a kind of project to shift it. And perhaps that's the counterpoint to the possibility of artificial intelligence, is a cultural project to rethink and redesign the way we live. And that would seem to be a great brief for designers. Instead of getting on that accelerationist bandwagon and finding more problems to solve, to actually solve the bigger, broader human problem of slowing down, if we are to ever get off this endless hamster wheel and achieve the promises of automation and robotics and artificial intelligence that have been the kind of mainstay of science fiction. It feels like that's within reach, but it's a social and political that will stop us from getting there, not the technological.